Welcome to The Economy Magazine. I'm Ayman Siksak with today's top stories from the world economy. Coming up today, we look at the reasons for the decline in oil prices and its implications on the global economy. And Israelis struggle with mounting debt as the costs of living continue to rise. But first, the headlines. The Federal Reserve on Wednesday signaled that it was on track to raise interest rates sometime next year, altering to keep rates near zero for a considerable time in a show of confidence in the U.S. economy. The U.S. Central Bank said it would take a patient approach in deciding when to bump borrowing costs higher at the end of a two-day meeting against the backdrop of solid domestic growth and trouble overseas. Chair Janet Yellen addressed the media, saying a patient approach meant the Federal Open Market Committee was unlikely to hike rates for at least a couple of meetings, meaning April next year at the earliest.
The committee continues to expect a moderate pace of growth going forward. Inflation has continued to run below the committee's 2% objective, and the recent sizable declines in oil prices will likely hold down overall inflation in the near term.
In more news from the U.S., South American leaders welcomed moves by the country and Cuba to restore diplomatic ties at the close of a summit in Argentina on Wednesday. The shift in policy spells good news for mutual commerce and transportation without ending a long-standing trade embargo. The embargo is set in legislation and needs congressional approval. President Barack Obama will likely face opposition when he seeks approval from Congress.
It'll be easier for Americans to travel to Cuba. It'll be easier for Americans to send money to Cuba. And it will be much easier for Americans to support the emerging private sector, even with trade and capital infusions. All of that should help a rather weak Cuban economy.
And the crisis in Russia is ongoing as Russians are deterred by the sharp decline in the ruble and are postponing or canceling trips abroad ahead of Christmas and New Year's celebrations. The tourism industry in Russia first registered the negative impact of the ruble devaluation this summer, when several major tourist companies collapsed, leaving hundreds of vacationers stranded abroad. The continued decline in ruble rates, which has been ongoing since, intensified the crisis by the end of the year.
When a person has a ruble salary and the price of a tour which used to cost $1,000 turns from 37,000 rubles to 60,000 rubles, this is a quite serious reason to think whether it's worth going to holidays with such an exchange rate.
And in other news related to the global decline in oil prices, Nigeria has downgraded growth forecasts for 2015 and suggested a cut in spending as Africa's top economy tries to respond to plummeting crude prices. Finance Minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala said an earlier estimate of a 6.35% growth in GDP for 2015 has been lowered to 5.5%. The finance minister also called for a reduction in government spending next year based on a revised growth forecast and a reduced benchmark oil price of $65 per barrel, down from $78 earlier this year.
And we're projecting a fiscal deficit of $755 billion, or 0.79% of GDP. And we're keeping domestic borrowing on a downward trend. We're keeping it at about the same as last year.
And with me now on Skype to discuss the global decline in oil prices is Lawrence Schreiber, co-president of Clarity Capital. Lawrence, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We've been following the crisis in Russia, and it seems that the main reason for the situation is the dramatic fall in prices of oil. Can you describe for us what's happened and why?
Absolutely. And I would just say that in addition to oil prices, which certainly do have a major impact, Russia is also being impacted by the geopolitical environment, including the sanctions that have been placed on it by the West, the U.S. and Europe, as a result of their actions in Crimea and more recently the Ukraine. But you're correct. The oil price is a dramatic impact in Russia because approximately 50% of their national revenues come from oil and gas. What we've seen, obviously, is a drop in global oil prices from about $110 a barrel over the summer to as low as $54 a barrel for U.S. crude, WTI, as recently as 2 days ago. And that's had a dramatic impact on Russia, with the ruble devaluing from 35 or 40 rubles to the dollar this summer to as weak as 80 rubles to the dollar just 2 days ago. We've now seen kind of a bit of a recovery, but the impact is truly dramatic.
And speaking globally, what have been the drivers of these dramatic shifts in prices? Can we detect a few main drivers for this trend?
Absolutely. Like every commodity, oil is affected by supply and demand. And we've seen both supply start to increase as new sources of oil around the world have come online, and demand has been somewhat weak as the global economy has been slow to recover. But in addition, oil has a real geopolitical impact, and that's been kind of a non-economic reason why prices have dropped so precipitously. What I mean is, specifically, Saudi Arabia has made a decision to push prices down. It's very clear in their actions through their leadership of OPEC that they've decided that they will take additional market share, or at least preserve their market share in the face of all of these newer sources of oil. So what they've done is, by increasing their own supply and actually continuing to exceed their own OPEC limits, they've pushed oil prices down at the expense of smaller producers such as Iran, Nigeria, Venezuela, and specifically impacting the newer sources of oil out of North America, such as oil sands out of Canada, and obviously a big impact on all of the the U.S. fracking activities in shale oil.
And Lawrence, in light of this dramatic volatility that you're describing in prices, is it at all possible to provide an outlook for oil price in 2015?
That's a very good question, obviously. We've seen a bounce already. I think once we started to approach $50 a barrel, I think that was kind of a natural floor, because that's close to the production cost of most of the producers. We've seen a bounce back just over the last 2 days from 54 to 57 or 58. Where it ultimately stabilizes is hard to predict, but I wouldn't be surprised to see oil recovering to $60 to $70 a barrel over the course of the next year or so, and probably stabilizing somewhere there.
Well, Lawrence Schreiber, co-president of Clarity Capital, thank you very much for this insight. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We move on now to Israel. The global trend of rising debts and soaring costs of living has not missed Israel, as more families join the circle of those in long-standing debts. Israeli organization Pamonim offers a possible solution by focusing on long-term ways of dealing with debt and poverty. I-24 News economy correspondent Anthony Lasmi met with representatives from Pamonim and brought this story.
Gil, a father of two, had been doing okay. He worked for a funeral services company. Its revenues were fine, but like more and more Israelis from the working and middle classes, he's accumulated loans and has ended up deep in debt.
One day you are raised up in the morning, and you understand that just your expenses over the months is, with all the loans that you need to pay because you got into this spiral, is more than what you earn. And to get out of this situation is very, very hard, because it's to change the way you live.
In order to make a change, Gil and his wife asked for help from Pamonim, a specialized NGO with volunteers across the country helping Israelis of all communities and all social strata with debt-related problems. In recent years, with major cost of living increases, there has been an increase in the impact of indebtedness on people.
We had 3-4 years ago, we had between 200 and 300 families who came to us per month. And I can say that last month we had almost 600 families come to us for help. And they find it very difficult to manage their finances because the income stays the same level, but the expenses have grown higher and higher.
Training people to live with what one has is the focus of Pamonim. The organization helps each family to redefine its budget, eliminate wasteful spending, buy less expensive, and buy basics first. Advice Gil got about switching supermarkets helped to save him about $500 per month. And that's not all.
400 shekel on the cable, 100 shekel on the telephone, 1,000 shekel on mobile. It's coming together to be something like 4,000 to 5,000 shekel per month. That until then, until Pa'amonim, I just gave someone on a monthly basis instead of enjoying it by myself.
The Israeli banking system is central to this story. Today, 67% of Israelis live on credit. The system of loans and interest payments often encircle borrowers into a vicious cycle.
You can get loans without having your own account in the bank, and they give you loans very, very easily with very, very high rates. And people think that they can give they'll take the loan and they'll be able to make the payments and give the payments back on time. But we find that it's too much.
Veronique Sarfati leads a group of Pa'amonim volunteers in the southern Israeli city of Ashkelon. Another mission of the organization is to help families to rebuild credit and restructure debts. The organization accompanies indebted families to the bank to renegotiate bills and rates. This is often, in her words, the struggle.
I tell the banks that the same way they called these people to offer them a loan to cover an overdraft, which they had no chance of paying back, they now have to address these issues because these families called Pa'amonim, which is responsible now. And in general, it is going very well.
Slowing growth, rising cost of living, stagnant wages, weak protection for consumers. All of these are factors that threaten to increase indebtedness in Israel and contribute to a downward economic spiral.
And now for a debrief on more stories from the global media, let's go to Media Watch with Daniel Roth. And with me now in the studio is Daniel Roth. Daniel, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Good to see you. So we've been discussing Amazon this week a lot. We've been discussing the strike in their Germany warehouses. But in the U.S., they've taken a different approach to warehousing. What's going on?
Yeah, so in the U.S., they've done two things to make sure there won't be strikes like in Germany. One of them is that their tens of 80,000 workers or something like this are not unionized. So that's step one. Step two is that they've deployed 15,000 of these robots you can see behind me in 10 of their warehouses across the US. And these robots are essentially there to speed up the process and, dare I say, replace workers.
Virtually, that must be what's happening.
Yeah, it is what's happening. And again, because workers aren't unionized in the U.S., it's much easier to get rid of them en masse or on individual bases. These robots can lift 720 pounds, and they take about 13 or 15 seconds to do what takes a human 30 seconds.
Some would say this is progress, no?
Some would say this is progress, and you could say it's progress because it takes some of the harder work away from people that it might stress their bodies, that it might be dangerous, that it's, we've seen in previous weeks, The Guardian ran a piece, someone who used to work in a warehouse said, it's better to be homeless than to work for Amazon, she wrote. And this is the kind of word going around about work in these warehouses. It is potentially progress, but only if the people who aren't able to get jobs because robots are replacing them have a means of income. That's the only way we can really responsibly think of this as progress.
And in terms of workers being unionized, is there any sense of solidarity between the workers in the U.S. with the strikers in Germany?
The cultures are so incredibly different. The work cultures in the U.S., by and large, workers there's a stronger history of unionization, of labor movement in the U.S. that's been diminished greatly in the last 50 years. This is a very big deal. In Europe, unions, the labor movement, these are very central to the culture, to the economies there. And in the U.S., there's been a very good job of kind of putting unions to the side in most cases. In some cases, unions are very strong, like in the realm of teachers and education, not higher education, but public education. But in the U.S., it's sort of on the periphery. They're not thinking about that. And so it's one of the big problems when you talk about replacing people's jobs with robots. There's not an organized way of talking about, so what do these people do instead to make a living? One answer is that you decouple income from work, from labor, so that people have a living wage no matter what they do. If they make art, if they go running, if they work in a warehouse, everyone ought to have a home and some food. Another answer is you find different kinds of work for people to do in new industries. One of the things we're seeing in the digital revolution is that the number of jobs available is going down. Since the Industrial Revolution, you see that the pyramid is growing and it's getting thinner and thinner. So it's harder and harder to find answers for what do people do instead, which brings us back to this question of how do people live if work and income are related and there isn't enough work.
Well, Daniel, and they've also recently launched drones, right? Amazon?
Yes. Yeah, so we'll see how that goes.
Pans out. Well, hopefully we won't be replaced by drones anytime soon.
I sure hope not.
But that concludes our Economy Magazine for today. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to post your comments on our page on i24news.tv and join us again tomorrow for more on the economy.